I'll also announce ahead of time I have to leave, unfortunately, a little early, so Mark will assume the duties of the moderator if I have to leave. When you think about the challenge of global warming, I think many people underestimate it. They also misunderestimate it too. In the sense that if you want to get 50% carbon reduction by 2050, which is the sort of minimum that scientists think we need to achieve, given the fact that global population is growing and global GDP is growing, you have to get to an energy system that is 85% more carbon efficient than what we have today. In other words, we have to have radically new energy systems that don't produce very much carbon. Getting to that 85% reduction, we're not going to get there by putting in your compact fluorescent light bulbs, nor will we get there even if we all drive Priuses or other types of hybrids. The challenge is so great that we really need fundamental innovation. And the last point I'll just make is, I think there's an assumption among many in Washington that somehow the magic of the marketplace will just occur if we just set the price at the right level, either set a price to a tax or in more likely reality set the price to a cap and trade, which is essentially a proxy price mechanism. Let me give you one counterfactual piece of evidence to suggest that that's overly simplistic at best. In the Netherlands, they have a de facto carbon tax on gasoline at around $4.20 a ton. Excuse me, $420 a ton. Most people in the U.S. talk about a carbon tax. Carbon price on carbon is $5 to $30 a ton. The number of electric cars in the Netherlands, I believe, is 0. So why would we believe that if we set the price of carbon at $30 a ton, we're going to magically have electric cars emerge? They don't have them in the Netherlands, where the price of carbon is 10 to 14 times higher than what it's going to be here. And the answer is largely because it requires a fundamental innovation. It requires a lot of hard work and focused innovation to be able to get those technologies on the marketplace, not just a price signal. So we're going to talk about that today. We're really honored and pleased to have as our first speaker, Congressman David Wu. Most of you know Congressman Wu. He is in the 6th term in Congress, representing Oregon's 1st congressional district, which is essentially Portland up to the Oregon coast. And among his assignments, he serves on the Science Committee, where he chairs the Science and Technology Subcommittee on Technology and Innovation.
We traditionally had a lot of hydro on the Columbia River and elsewhere on the rivers. We have a large installed base of wind power. Geothermal power is coming online, wave power off the coast. The first field is being developed, not quite ready, and there's a large solar industry derived from our strength in silicon in chip design and chip manufacture. So we have and biofuels. We have a broad portfolio, a good mix. It's about as good a start, I think, as most folks have made, spurred in part by tax incentives that the state government installed a few years ago. Now, one would like to think that with a combination of tax incentives and other proposed limitations, such as cap and trade, that we can get to where we want to go for a future carbon footprint. And I think that it is very, very important to have these incentives in place. And it's very, very important to make a start in sending a signal to the market and sending a signal to everyone where we want to go to pass cap and trade legislation or a carbon tax, one or the other. But right now, the train leaving the station is a cap and trade system. But at the end of the day, as Rob alluded to in his opening comments, getting the price signals to be strong enough so that people actually start switching over their behavior is such a costly process, such a painful process, that I think it's very, very difficult for our political system or any political system indeed to achieve that with a regulatory approach alone. Again, the statute, the regulations are very important. It's an important signal. It's an important sign of commitment. I think that the only way we're going to be able to get to where we are and where we want to go is by substantially, and I mean substantially, such as a tenfold, making a tenfold increase, substantially increasing our commitment to research and development in the energy field. We need that across the spectrum. We need that not only in game-changing technologies, fundamental research such as proposed in the ARPA-E programs that we passed in the last Congress, but we also need a broad base of applied research and technology development so that we can work on our installed base and also implement the fundamental research that needs to be done. What's the scale that I'm talking about? Right now, call it roughly $3 billion that we spend a year on energy research. Ideally, we'd add a zero to that, but I'm not sure that that's doable. But keep in mind that what we're talking about is spending roughly roughly in the ballpark between what we spend on NASA, which is about $17 billion a year, to what we spend on NIH, which is in the low 30s, low 30 billions of dollars. That's the kind of energy R&D program which I think is going to be necessary to marry with a regulatory approach, a statutory approach, in order to get us to where we want to go. It is never easy to call up resources, to marshal the resources for an effort this large. But I just want to point out that as a percentage of GDP, just take NASA as one agency, as a percentage of GDP, if we were currently expending on NASA what we did in 1969, the height of the Apollo moon program, we'd be spending about $78 or $80 billion a year on NASA. That is, the percentage that NASA absorbed of the American GDP in 1969 would be equivalent for today's GDP to about $70 to $80 billion a year. So if that is what we were willing to do, to run several missions to the moon, in order to fundamentally change our economy, our pattern of energy use, and the world's pattern of energy use, and restructure the world's economy, I'd submit to you that a commitment, call it roughly half of, in GDP terms, roughly half of the commitment that we made to getting to the moon is a reasonable one to make, and one that, in comparison to the amounts of money that we've seen flow out, whether it's for wars, for bank bailouts, or to re-stimulate the economy, is a reasonable price to pay to purchase an insurance policy so that our descendants don't have problems to deal with that we don't want them to have to deal with. Rob, thank you very much, and I'll turn it back over to you.
We've got time for probably a couple of questions. Maybe if they're immediate here and want to start, go ahead and raise your hand.
Beat them all down.
Good.
Okay.
Thanks very much. There's still some seats here if you want to.
Great, and yeah, if you're on a hand, or if you could move into one, that would be helpful, so there's more room. Well, we're pleased to now that we're joined by Congressman Jay Inslee. Congressman Inslee is actually had two stints in Congress. Currently, he was first in the 4th Congressional District, 92 to 94, and has been in the 1st Congressional District in Washington State since 1999, where he's been a leader on issues around environment and global warming. Since 2005, Congressman Inslee has served on the Energy and Commerce Committee, where he's promoted his vision of a clean energy future, including the new Apollo Energy Act and other legislation that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In 2007, he was appointed to the 15-member Select Committee on Energy Independence and Global Warming, and continues to serve on this panel. Before coming to Congress, he was a state legislator and a prosecutor in Washington State.
Thank you. Thanks for letting me join you today. I'm inspired by the book. Has everybody got this book here? This is an interesting book. It's called The Emerging Climate Consensus, and has some of these Chinese characters.
They're Japanese.
Japanese, excuse me. Well, I think this means in Japanese, pass the House energy bill. I think that's a rough translation, but it does give me a segue into how I wanted to start my comments. I spent last week, or week before last, in China with Speaker Pelosi, talking to Chinese leadership and looking at what they're doing on energy, and I want to make some comments about that as a segue to what I think American policy should be. While in China, we visited a company that is developing a thin film treatment to put on windows to do thin film photovoltaic electrical generation with zero CO2. Goes right on your windscreen, windshield, or windows. You can put on any horizontal vertical surface, and presto, you got clean electricity. They're developing that in Hong Kong for manufacturing in the Pearl River Delta area. Right next to them in the same scientific park is a company that's developing the next generation of LED lighting that can be 50 to 70 to 80% more energy efficient to light the world, again in the same place for the same manufacturing. We then took a bullet train that went 220 miles an hour to Tianjin and went to a manufacturing firm making electrical cars. And the company that we met intended to have a car in 2 years that will go 100 miles on all electrical charge and goes 80 miles an hour and essentially functions like a normal car. Right next to that was the manufacturing center of the Vestas wind turbine manufacturing. The message in this is that we are in an international competition for potential ability to grow our economy, and the competitors are in China and other places. And that we now have an opportunity, an obligation, I believe a moral obligation to our economy and to ourselves to get into that competition. And the legislation we are now considering will get us into that competition in several ways, but I want to address the R&D component of the start with. By the way, two of the companies I mentioned that are doing this research in China are actually American companies. It's DuPont doing the thin film photovoltaic, but the manufacturing and actually the development work will be done in China. Now, I think this is a prototypical moment for America in our research and development and deployment budgets. And the reason I believe that is I heard my friend David talking about the space race. And I think the space race is instructive. If you look back at the 60s, we were in a similar position in 1960-61 as we are today. And the fact that we were not in the game. Russia was in the game. They had launched multiple orbital missions. They had launched multiple ton spacecraft. They had boost capacity 4 or 5 times higher than ours. We had launched just like a little tin can. Our rockets were blowing up on the launch pad. We haven't even invented Tang yet. But we then had a young president who came before us and asked and inspired the country to go to the moon, and we got into the competition to go to the moon. And even though we were late, even though we were second in the race, we ended up dominant. And the reason we ended up dominant is we recognized an innate American talent for innovation, for creativity, and entrepreneurship. And we engaged the federal government in an activity to finance some of the necessary research and development to actually go to the moon, and it was spectacularly successful, even though there were those who doubted it. I think that metaphor, although not perfect, is instructive about the ability of launching a major revolution if, in fact, you develop the research and development portfolio and federal budget to actually get that done. I'm optimistic about our ability to do this. I became optimistic. I wrote a book called Apollo's Fire, kind of on the theme that Americans could do this. And I got to know these people all over the country. It's not just China where people are doing this. Last weekend, I met with the people from Ramgen in Seattle. They're developing a coal sequestration, CO2 sequestration compressor technology that can save 30-35% of electrical costs for compression. Day before that, I met the guys doing Bright Source, concentrated solar energy, that just signed 3 contracts with California utilities to do multiple megawatts of concentrated solar electricity. This morning, I just spoke to a group this morning about efficiency, and just as I was getting out of the car, I heard a radio ad about a company advertising to the federal government saying, come hire us, we'll reduce your computer electrical uses by 70 to 80% in an efficiency mode. We are having the seeds of this development in the country, but we have an abysmally inadequate, pathetically weak, impotent research budget in this country to get this job done. To put this in perspective, we were about, in real terms, about $15 billion a year during the space race during that decade. We are about at a research budget federally of about $3, maybe $4 billion for our clean energy research budget. That includes nukes, sequestered coal, photovoltaic, hydrokinetic, the whole shooting match. We are nowhere close to where we were in that particular endeavor. Well, President Obama has called for a research budget of about $15 billion a year on a sustained basis. We have made some modest steps forward in the stimulus bill, where we had about $13 billion associated with clean energy. But that is a one-time shot. In the bill that we passed out of our Commerce Committee, we have 1.5% of the auction revenues essentially dedicated to clean energy research. That's about $1.5 billion a year. And another $1 billion for clean coal sequestration research. So we've increased by about $2.5 billion a year the multi-year commitment to the federal government in this bill. But I must say that is still well below the mark. And I think the mark President Obama has set of about $15 billion a year is a realistic one, given both the scope of the challenge and the nature of our possibility to maximize it. So I believe that ought to be the national goal. I'm going to be pushing in the next several weeks to continue to increase the commitment of our auction proceeds and our permits in the cap and trade system that will be dedicated to R&D. It will be our best shot in 20 years to increase the R&D budget of this country. And I could give you a list of 100 people who can put that money to good work. Now, we've talked about different ways to do it in a more advanced way, more collaborative way to do it. But the first thing we have to do is have some bucks to put behind this effort. So I hope that many of you in this room share that view. I hope you will join this effort in the next few weeks in some way to maximize this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to really start a clean energy revolution, which starts with R&D. And let me tell you why I think R&D is so important. It is clear that we can use existing technologies to do huge steps forward. We know there's huge things we can do in efficiency, in buildings, in cars. We know we have huge additional resources available with wind technology, using existing wind technology. We know expanding public transportation has huge efficiencies that can reduce carbon emissions using existing technology. But any way you slice it, Secretary of Energy Chu is correct. We can maybe get halfway to the goal of 80% reductions without existing technology. But to get to an 80% reduction, essentially a decarbonized economy for the United States, we need substantial new technologies to help us. They are on the way. We need Uncle Sam to help out, and I hope you'll help many of us make sure that that happens. That's my story. I'm sticking to it. I wonder if I can stand for easy questions or soft, gentle criticisms. Those are all yes. Could you speak up just a bit?
Sure. You're currently pushing some legislation to get high efficiency transmission.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you have any plans or strategies for that while the climate bill is moving to market.
Yes, the question was about transmission. And one thing that clearly needs some improvement in our energy bill is a transmission component that will help the planning, siting, and we hope financing of transmission corridors. We know this is necessary because we know we have tremendous resources of solar energy in the Southwest. In fact, it could be anywhere in the country, really. Huge wind resources, hydrokinetic, both tidal and wave power off of our coastlines, offshore wind. but all of them depend upon getting transmission to the place the electricity is used. And anyone who's looked at the sorry state of trying to site a transmission line knows that it usually is a multi-generational time period to site a transmission line if it ever can be done in this country. So what we are hoping to do is to have at least in the western United States, at least, a backup siting authority for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to back up if the local communities are unable to site these very vital, important transmission facilities, if they are unable to do so in a reasonable time period. We also hope nationwide to provide backup siting authority for underground facilities. And both existing technology in DC can go underground, and there is some new superconducting material which can go underground and have a backup siting authority somewhat similar to our gas pipeline siting authority now, and make that nationwide. We think that this type of proposal will avoid some of the consternation and some of the concerns of my East Coast colleagues while allowing the West to move forward. And above ground, and the whole country will move forward below ground. It is absolutely pivotal. We have done some good things in this bill, setting renewable electrical standard goals of 15% of renewable energy by 2020. But it's going to be very difficult to meet them if we can't get transmission to connect those renewable generated sites with where the electrical usage is going to be needed. So we're going to be working the next couple of weeks to try to find consensus on that. I'm hopeful there is a good chance we'll have this bill on the floor of the House before the July 4th resource. That's ambitious, but I think it's possible, if not shortly thereafter. And I have to tell you, things are going quite well in this regard. Many people believe it would be impossible to get a bill out of the Commerce Committee. We proved them wrong. And the reason we proved them wrong is that we responded to the multiple diverse views of this country and multiple diverse interests of this country and came up with a good consensus product. So I hope we now finish with the transmission piece in the next couple of weeks. Yes?
Is there a plan to sort of dedicate maybe a portion of the allowance revenue or some other funding stream to get that important program off the ground?
The question was essentially about what we call the Green Bank, and the question is, are we going to have a dedicated funding resource? I hope to accomplish that. That is of akin with my effort to have a dedicated source for R&D as well. This Green Bank is incredibly important to help these emerging companies across the valley of death. A lot of these folks have come up with a great idea in their garage. They'll build a prototype, they'll get venture capital, but when it comes time to build the first commercial scale plant, which might cost $10 to $100 million, they can't get financing to have that first commercial plant. So this is a very, very important component of this plan. We're going to hope to have dedicated funds. I hope you can help us out and tell all your friends. I think the time is up. Thank you very much. Good luck to all of us.
All right, thank you, Congressman Lindsley. 2 housekeeping notes. We will adjourn precisely at 2:30, and really will encourage people to stand in there. Please come on and grab a seat because there's some other people out in the hallway. So there's a whole bunch of seats, probably 5-10 seats here. I'm going to introduce folks in the order that we're going to go in. I'll introduce everyone at once, and then we'll hear from each of them, and we'll have some time at the end for discussion. Our next speaker is Nate Lewis. Dr. Lewis is the George Agros Professor of Chemistry at Caltech, where he's been there since 1988. He has also served as the principal investigator at the Beckman Institute of Molecular Materials Resource Center at Caltech since 1992. His research interests are the same as mine, actually, artificial photosynthesis and electronic noses. He received his PhD in chemistry at MIT. He's published over 300 papers. He's an Alfred Sloan Fellow, a Camille and Henry Dreyfus Teacher Scholar, and Presidential Young Investigator, and numerous other awards. I'll mention the last one, which is probably the coolest. Just in March, Rolling Stone named Nate as the number 17 on the list of people who are changing America. Next will be Michael Schellenberger. Michael is an author and policy analyst who works on and writes about energy technology, innovation, and climate change. He's the president of the Breakthrough Institute, along with his colleague Ted Nordhaus. and is a leading national advocate to make the U.S. For the U.S. to make large public-private investments in clean energy. He is also a co-author, along with Ted, of a really amazing book, Breakthrough, and a 2004 essay called The Death of Environmentalism. In 2002, he co-founded the Apollo Alliance and the Breakthrough Institute. And in 2008, Time magazine named him and Ted as heroes of the environment. After Michael, we'll hear from Mark Muro. Mark is the fellow and director of policy at the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institution, where he manages the program's public policy analysis and leads policy research projects. He's been led the development of a major Brookings initiative called Blueprint for American Prosperity, and is the co-author of a blueprint paper called Energy Discovery Innovation Institutes, a step towards America's energy sustainability. And last is Bill Von Billion. Many of you, if you're in the Senate, you know Bill. Bill directs MIT's Washington office, where he's worked since 2006. Prior to that, he was legislative director for Senator Bill Lieberman, and in that role, and in my experience with working with Bill for 15 years, was the most knowledgeable Senate staffer on innovation and tech policy. He served on several National Academy panels, has written extensively on science and tech policy. In 2007, he received the IEEE Distinguished Public Service Award. Most related to the topic today, he is a co-author with Charles Weiss from Georgetown of a new book that was just published in 2 months ago, Structuring an Energy Technology Revolution, an MIT Press book. I would encourage you to get that. It's a very detailed book about exactly how the process of energy innovation occurs. So with that, we'll turn it over to Nate.
Thanks very much, and thanks for showing your interest in coming today. There is a handout, and if you don't have it, you're free to get it at the end. I won't follow it closely, but it just can serve as a resource later on for people that might want to follow up. I always want questions and follow up. You can reach me through my email address at Caltech, which is just easily Googled. Nate Lewis at Caltech will get me. I'm a practicing scientist. I'm in there in the lab with my graduate students and postdocs every day. We're working on a disruptive technology that we don't even know what it looks like yet. But we know that there should be a lot of those ideas. We can't just get there with existing technology in a cost-effective, globally scalable way. And I want to try to set the scale of what the challenge really is, and then try to calibrate us and also highlight where the deeply embedded technical challenges are in energy. So to set the scale, if you add up all the energy content of all the oil, coal, gas, and nuclear power consumed on our planet in an average year, and divide by the number of seconds in a year, you can get what the energy meter would be reading on average every day, every second. And that's about 14 trillion watts. So right now, on average, our planet uses uses energy at a rate of 14 trillion watts. That means that if we are to think about an energy system that cuts emissions within our lifetimes by 85%, on the way to 100%, because remember, CO2 emissions all add up, and the 80% goal doesn't stabilize carbon dioxide levels. It will still allow them to continue to build up. Just an interim goal on the way. You have to be talking about supplying tens of trillions of watts of clean energy within our lifetimes. Now that's if energy demand stays constant. Most projections, in fact almost all, to developing countries show global energy demand doubling within 30 years. And they build in already tremendous amounts of energy efficiency. If you didn't build that in, they show tripling of energy demand. If you built in the amount of energy saved equivalent to all the energy we currently use, you might hold global energy demand to double. And if you doubled that again and saved as much energy as twice the energy we already use, you hold it constant. So by any measure, we are talking about meeting demand, no matter how much you put in for efficiency, on the order of 15 trillion watts. Some projections say we need 20 trillion watts, but it's something like that. Let me calibrate for you what 15 trillion watts of clean energy means. A nuclear power plant, optimally sized at the level we can build them safe, provides a gigawatt output. 15 trillion watts is 15,000 nuclear power plants. That's one every single day somewhere in the world between now and 2050. If you don't do that, you have to do something else in combination with that to meet that level of clean energy demand. That's assuming you save as much energy already as all the energy we use combined. So that's really the scale of the challenge. It's fine to think about 40 nuclear power plants or 50 to replace ones that we would normally put out of service. But a serious expansion of nuclear power, although it could well be in the arsenal, is on the order globally of a few thousand nuclear power plants, because that would be 10% of the demand. That's the scale of energy. To give you another feeling for what that scale would be, we can talk about, as I believe we should be seriously talking about, sequestering CO2 from fixed sites like coal-fired power plants. If we took all the fossil emissions just in the United States as CO2, and indeed buried them underground, and we took that CO2 and spread it uniformly over the continental United States, after doing that for 50 years, it would be equivalent to raising the elevation of our continent by 5 centimeters. No technology or society has ever buried that much of anything under our soils and lived with it. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing it. It does mean that the scale of energy dictates that what works in your backyard, or even what works in your region, has to be thought of how we can export, copy, and duplicate it to countries and if we're to really have a solution to the CO2 problem, because my emissions are your emissions, and they mix within a year. If you don't build a nuclear power plant somewhere in the world more than once a week for 50 straight years, and you don't capture all the carbon from all the new coal-fired power plants forever starting today, you've left 80% of the problem on the table. If you need the arithmetic of how much you can get from renewable energy resources globally compared to these 15 trillion watts, those numbers have been compiled. They're actually, best knowledge is in this PowerPoint for you. There's some in, you might get a few terawatts. You get 10% of the issue that way solved if you built 5 million state-of-the-art windmills. They're about a megawatt. You could get a few, 10% maybe from biofuels if you exhaustively planted crops everywhere we currently don't plant food. You can't get much from hydroelectricity because it's pretty much maxed out. All the rivers and dams are pretty much built where we can do it. You could get it from the sun. It's a huge resource. More energy from the sun hits the earth in 1 hour than all the energy consumed on our planet in an entire year. But it's now expensive and it's intermittent. But technology can fix that. You can't make more wind when there isn't more wind, but you can lower the cost of converting a natural resource into energy humans can use. But to give you the scale, we hear about solar thermal towers in the desert. That's the cheapest way to make solar electricity right now. And they can have some energy storage. If you think about those parabolic troughs, I can tell you, if you were in the United States and you wanted to make half of our energy that way by 2050, you would have to install one solar dish a second, every second, for the next 50 straight years. That's the scale of energy, and the scale dictates what technologies will scale. If you wanted to do that with photovoltaic cells, you would have to build and install 1 million solar roofs a day, every day, from now until then. So this leads to the key technology challenges to meet an energy system at scale, which the community of scientists like myself I'll get to them in a minute, will almost universally tell you are the challenges. One is, as I referred, just carbon capture and storage. We talk about the cost of additional electricity from capturing CO2 from smokestacks. We assume that when you put it under the ground, it will stay there. Nobody knows if that's true or not. Since CO2 levels last for a few hundred years, we have to know it doesn't leak 1% a year for a few hundred years. The companies want a carbon credit if it stays there for 10 years, and they want to walk away. And then they'll be left if one of them leaks or brings up arsenic, contaminated groundwater because of the pressure, with really toxic resources. And we'll have secondary carbon markets, and we'll have toxic resources on those markets. We need a technical basis to know this works, which we do not have now. We need to be monitoring the sites. We need to design scientific experiments so we can write environmental impact reports that says we can, with integrity, put CO2 down for 100 years and it's not likely to leak. We have no technical program even slated to do that yet. We need a way to massively store energy because you can't bring on large amounts of intermittent renewables like solar or wind without a way to compensate for the intermittency. The fact that it's not there all the time, or even most of the time, you can count on it. The one cloudy day, you can't have a big red switch with the letters United States of America on it, switching off all the electricity because a cloud came over your solar thermal towers. So we need a way to get massive energy storage. I think we need a way to get globally scalable solar conversion systems, things that can be painted on, things that can be rolled out by carpet. Because it's very hard to envision, even growing the industry the way we have it now, on the hockey stick curves, that you would ever get to scale of hundreds of thousands or millions of solar roof installed systems every day. In 5 years, we'll be 1 billion behind. These are big numbers, and this dictates what real scalable technologies need to be. People don't understand on batteries that the cost of the raw materials that goes into a lithium battery is now 75% cost of making the battery. So that means that if you have economies of scale in manufacturing, you could at most save 20% from existing lithium-ion technology. And of course, if we have more demand on batteries, the cost of the raw materials will probably go up. This is why we really need to think about revolutionary new battery technology to enable electric cars and plug-in hybrids to really work. If you want to go to these nuclear reactors, we have no materials to build them out of third-generation systems because they're higher temperature than the ones we know now, and the NRC can't permit them. They would need 25 years of experience on the ground to permit a reactor commercially from the day the material was invented. We need to do modeling and measurement and accelerated material science to enable us to build those generations of nuclear reactors safely, of course, without so much proliferation concern. And finally, we need liquid fuels for transportation. We are all focused on plug-in hybrids and electric cars correctly. But you need to remember that 40% of transportation fuel demand can't be replaced by electricity. Nobody has yet invented a plug-in hybrid airplane or a plug-in hybrid ship or a heavy-duty vehicle. And that's 40% of transportation demand. You can't cut emissions by 80% if you don't decarbonize and substitute liquid transportation fuels for these things. This is why we need to be doing everything we know how to do now and not set up a false dichotomy of, if we just know how to do now, we'll fix these other problems later. Because later isn't, it's getting late early here, right? If we don't do the R&D now, in order to set in line our ability to conquer some of these key gaps, we'll get 5 or 10 years in, and we'll be up against a brick wall. We don't have to solve them all, but we have to get in place a way to get some of them under control. This is why I can tell you, every major university and research area now has a clean energy technology, engineering and science center, because we know this problem isn't under control, and that it's more than sending price signals and more than setting cap and trade. That's necessary It will get us a way to deploy existing technologies. It won't get us by itself the cost signals to do the R&D. So thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. And thanks all of you for coming. I think we ran out of these, but this is a little pamphlet we put together that lays out some of our policy ideas, which is the subject I'm going to speak on. But if you put your name, if you're interested in getting a copy, we'll mail you one. Just put your name on the list over there, and also just indicate whether you'd like to receive emails, since I've got a sort of private email listserv that I send out to occasionally. So I want to speak to policy framework broadly, and then I believe Mark and Bill will speak more specifically to what that framework should entail to encourage the kind of technology innovation that we all believe we need in order to make clean energy cheap. And even that idea itself it sort of sounds strange for those of you, and even for us that have been doing climate policy for a long time, because the dominant idea has actually been to make fossil fuels expensive. And the idea has been put a price on carbon, gradually raise it, and over time the marketplace will select those technologies that are those clean technologies that are the least expensive to bring online. But that idea, which is sort of embodied in cap and trade legislation and in the European emissions trading scheme, runs headlong into a serious political problem. And that's that the publics around the world don't want to spend a lot more money on energy. It's not a big conspiracy. It's not just the fossil fuel lobby, but really ordinary folks don't want to spend the amount of more money on fossil fuels that you would be required to spend on clean energy. And so what Nate described is what we refer to as the technology gap. As sort of a young environmentalist, I was sort of trained to believe that really fossil fuels were not that much more inexpensive than clean energy, that really clean energy technologies were really very close in price. And it's really been thanks to Nate and a number of other very good independent energy analysts who have educated me that the technology gap is real between fossil fuels and clean energy, and it's not going to be easily overcome through a modest price on carbon. And to illustrate that, I think it's important to look to the one real-world example that we have of this, and that's in Europe. In the summer of last year, the summer of 2008, the price of carbon dioxide per ton in Europe reached $40. And at the same time, Europe was moving forward with plans to build 50 new coal plants over the next 5 years. And that went against all the models which said that if you had a carbon price at that level, that it would only be cost effective to build new coal plants if they were installed with carbon capture and storage. That proved not to be the case, coal still being so much cheaper than the available cleaner alternatives. The system that the Europeans set up, which is the system that the Waxman-Markey climate legislation would replicate, would allows European companies, or European countries rather, and companies, to continue to increase their emissions, but they can offset their emissions by purchasing carbon offsets, for example, for tree planting in other countries or dam building. In fact, recently the German environment minister said, you know, these offsets are great because it means that we can continue to build coal plants and still be reducing our emissions, which is an interesting elocution if you really think about it. And I think our view is different. It's that really, if we're going to have the radical technological revolution that you need over the next 50 or even 100 years, you have to have a massive improvement in the performance of these clean energy alternatives and also in these decarbonization alternatives. The problem, as Representative Inslee mentioned, is that the Waxman-Markey climate legislation would put just $1 billion or $1.5 billion a year, depending on the price of carbon, into R&D. And again, President Obama has called for $15 billion. Most energy experts that we talk to, there's been one sign-on letter by energy experts, including a couple of Nobelists, who say we need to spend $30 billion. And that's just the R&D part. That's just sort of the laboratory, your basic demonstration of those projects. One of the lessons you learn when you look at the history of clean energy innovation is that you actually have to build these machines in the real world to get the big price declines. So for example, Denmark really contributed greatly to the revolution in wind turbines. There were these really small little wind turbines in California. We have them on the Altamont Pass. They're sort of really quickly turning, blades that are kind of bird blenders. And what Denmark did is that they started deploying these big wind turbines offshore where the wind was strong enough to make for a much cheaper form of energy. And that required the government openly investing billions of dollars over several years to achieve these technological innovations. It wasn't work in the laboratory, it was work in the real world. So that means that you need to be spending somewhere closer to $50 or even $80 billion a year, which is about what we spend on military innovation, technology innovation, to achieve these big gains. So this is not a sort of a small shift from $3 billion to maybe $4 or $5 billion a year. We're talking about an order of magnitude larger. A lot of the assumption has been, well, that deployment, that pull from the market of these new clean energy technologies will happen with the carbon price established by a cap and trade legislation. The problem is that the EPA estimates in its analysis of the Waxman-Markey legislation that the price would only be about $12 to $15 a ton. In fact, several analyses, including one that the Breakthrough Institute conducted, found that really, with all the offsets that get used, there is no cap. In fact, it's just a target that you have. It's a non-binding target, and you can make all sorts of predictions and scenarios, but the law itself, as it's currently drafted, would in fact not require any emissions reductions under business as usual estimates by the Energy Information Agency. As for the renewable energy standard, this is the regulation that would seemingly require a certain amount of renewables to be implemented in each state. In analysis both by Breakthrough but also by the Union of Concerned Scientists, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and several other groups have found that the renewable energy standard in the Waxman-Markey climate legislation would in fact not increase renewable deployment above the baseline predicted by the EIA. And so it all raises this question that, once you kind of get clear about what the bill would require, what it wouldn't require, once you realize that it would set a carbon price about a third or maybe even a fourth the price of the European price, which still didn't prevent new coal-fired power plants from being built, what is the alternative to that? And in a phrase, we call it making clean energy cheap. And we look back on the history of technology innovation in the United States, which is really a remarkable history. It's often said that we need to have an energy technology revolution that's like the information technology revolution. And we agree with that, but it's funny, we didn't have a cap and trade on typewriters. We didn't have a telegraph tax. We didn't have a tax or a price on fax transmissions to result in personal computers or the internet. These were things that the government invested in directly. So in the late 1950s, during the space race that Senator Inslee talked about, and Representative Inslee and Representative Wu spoke of, the Pentagon knew it needed microchips. They were very expensive. They were about $1,000 a chip. In less than 10 years, the Pentagon had bought so many of them that the price came down to just $20 a chip. And now microchips are everywhere. They're in our cell phones. They're in our cars. They're ubiquitous. They're cheap. And that's exactly the kind of process we need to pursue with things like solar panels and solar technologies. Similarly, for the internet, much has been said about how terrible and wasteful government laboratories are. In fact, the precursor to the internet was invented by DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Applications program. And in fact, if you look back at the history of innovation, technology innovation, and specifically the history of energy technology innovation, you cannot find an example where we priced the older technology out of the market. In other words, we did not go from wood to coal because we had a wood tax or a cap and trade system on wood. We didn't move from coal to natural gas for pricing mechanisms. We did it through technology innovation, usually government funded and government directed. And I'll just end by saying that we think that kind of an approach where the revenue from allowances is predominantly invested directly into technology innovation with large government contracts for procurement and deployment is an approach that would result in far faster price declines in these new clean energy technologies. We think it would also result in many more jobs, more quickly created. I promise I'll stop. I promise not to go on much more. We think it will result in much faster technological innovation, which is the ultimate prize here in a world where global energy consumption is going to triple or quadruple by century's end. That's a strategy of making clean energy and decarbonization technologies cheap rather than attempting to make fossil fuels much more expensive. Thank you very much.
Just been told to segue to become a moderator as soon as I finish. So I'm going to give myself 40 minutes. Take that with you. Anyway, I'm Mark Miro with the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings, and I want to add my appreciation to you all for coming. What I thought I'd do is just turn this conversation a little more specifically to where we are today in terms of federal policy on energy innovation. And to do that, I want to highlight some of the findings of the recent Brookings report I helped write entitled Energy Discovery Innovation Institutes that discusses these issues in some depth and have some influence. In fact, I've heard some of my material taken by others here, so showing that we're making some inroads. But I want we could be basically a team of some of the best academic and laboratory energy people last year and released this major report and had really two quite simple findings. Basically, we said that both the scale and the character of federal energy innovation programs remain woefully inadequate to address the gravity, the urgency, and the complexity of the energy challenges Nate and Mike have been discussing. So the first point, we said that the current magnitude of U.S. R&D is just grossly inadequate. That was the phrase we used. It remains far too small to ensure the development of a sustainable energy economy. We are fairly generously assigned, estimated the outlay about $4 billion a year. Nate, I think, thinks it might be a little lower. We'll be generous. I think that's about half the $8 billion high that the nation had in 1980 in constant dollars. And it's just a fifth the level of the early 1980s as a share of GDP. So at a time when these issues have come to the fore and greater clarity has emerged on the urgency of the issue, our effort level is lower. I'm sure these numbers will go up with the arrival of stimulus money and presumably the funding of FY 2010 budget requests and hopefully the revenue from a cap trade system. But we still, in the meantime, have the fact that we're spending $4 billion in federal energy R&D, and that's about 0.1% of the energy sector's gross output. By contrast, the healthcare industry receives the equivalent of about 2% of annual sales in federal R&D. That implies then that if we were to invest in energy innovation at just the same rate that we do in healthcare R&D, we'd be investing more than $20 billion a year. So that's $20 billion a year compared to the current $4 billion. So at minimum, we're just a fifth of the needed level. If you compare energy to sectors like pharmaceuticals and IT that deploy far larger R&D flows, you reach even higher benchmarks for investment. But that's just a scale problem. We also argue that the character and format of U.S. energy research also remains inadequate, informed as they are, in our view, by sort of certain legacy preoccupations and structures. Begin with the Department of Energy really isn't even in the energy innovation business. In fact, its entire energy program, of which innovation is simply one component, makes up about 20 to 30% of the agency's budget. The bulk of funding and operational competence remain focused on managing and cleaning up after the nation's nuclear weapons system. And otherwise, the research efforts that do exist remain fragmented and, in our view, insular. They're fragmented in the sense that DOE's R&D offices and programs tend to be organized around sort of energy technology of the year, accumulation over time, leading to stovepipe organizations. And these efforts are insular given the inherited security culture. As a consequence, the bulk of the DOE's research work excellent though it is in some areas, remains just simply too isolated and removed to the marketplace to quickly produce and commercialize game-changing breakthroughs. We simply are not leveraging the relationship between public investment and the wider economy. So the bottom line, we're neither doing enough nor doing it in the smartest way possible. So we have an inefficient as well as too small effort now. What should we do then? In our report, we urge that Congress and the administration simply invest much more in energy innovation and employ quite different paradigms in doing so, rather than simply pouring more money down the same channels. The first part, you've heard the figure, I think Representative Wu mentioned it as well. We feel we should be spending on the order of 20 to 30 billion a year on federal energy R&D. That's basically 5 to 6 times where we are now. Otherwise, we think we need to try some new things institutionally. Especially compelling to us are partnership-based, applications-oriented, performance-oriented models that seek to link basic science to application science to commercialization efforts and to really accelerate the movement of innovative technologies into the marketplace. Along these lines, our paper strongly supported boosting basic science energy through the funding of the Energy Frontier Research Centers, conducting disruptive research through ARPA-E as well. Both of these things are emerging as actualities. We also propose the creation of something else, a network of several dozen energy discovery innovation institutes, regionally based, multidisciplinary innovation hubs in which universities, industry, and the national labs would collaborate with investors, nearby industry clusters, and local governments to rapidly develop and transfer killer energy applications into the marketplace. By doing all of this at some scale, a vast, essentially an uncontemplated scale, we argue the nation has a shot at generating breakthroughs that will produce thousands of clean jobs, reduce our dependence on foreign oil, and decarbonize the economy. All right, I'll give, let me give you an assessment of how are we doing and moving in this direction. In terms of institutional experimentation, change has begun. In terms of the scale of effort, it's simply not there. Beginning with the organizational agenda, we're delighted to see in the DOE's FY 2010 budget request, support for Energy Frontier Research Centers, work to manage stimulus acts funding of ARPA-E, and the startup of 8 multidisciplinary energy innovation hubs, similar to what we advocate in our paper. And it's obviously welcome that the Waxman-Markey bill allocates allowance revenue to clean energy efficiency efforts, carbon capture and sequestration, electric and other advanced technology cars, and yes, the basic R&D piece. In this case, 8 clean energy innovation centers, regional hubs quite like ours. All of this is the right sort of stuff. The problem is, again, the scale of the contemplated investments is simply too small. I just suggest we need to be spending 20 to 30 billion a year every year on energy R&D, but now DOE non-defense basic energy for FY 2010 looks like about only 3 billion really for true energy research, including the Office of Science, basic energy, money for the Frontier Research Centers and ARPA-E, as well as the Innovation Hub. So we're about a 7th or a 10th of the needed annual outlay. As to ACE's basic clean energy R&D line, the bill comes to about 1.5% of the bill's allowances, maybe 1.3 billion a year on average, at a carbon price of $16 to $21. So, that's 20 billion all told through 2025. It's about a 15th of the 300 billion we think we need to invest. And this is important, especially because the cap trade revenues represent the nation's best chance of finding the money to sufficiently fund innovation in the face of tight budgets that are going to prevail for the foreseeable future. So, given all this, it goes without saying that the first order of business should be to fully fund DOE's FY 2010 budget, which moves to establish at least the key elements of a strong energy innovation system. So we have the outline possibly in place. And beyond that, the watchword for Waxman-Markey and all the other efforts to develop a comprehensive response has got to be, we must do more, much more on the innovation front. And that has, really received much attention. So whether through direct appropriations, revenue rates for carbon tax, capital outlay, increase that energy innovation effort by order of magnitude. We have a lot of work there. So I think Billy will speak a bit on some of the topics and as well as opportunities.
Let me just say that I think it's a fair assumption, having talked to many people at places I recognize, the vast majority, right, it is very hard to encompass technology, organizational change. Let me talk for a minute why that is, right? So, that it's not enough just to sort of toss R&D money at this thing, right? We're going to have a larger kind of systems look at this kind of apparatus. R&D is crucial, but it's got to be. Energy is really hard. We do great technology advances in this country, and we do them by going over the mountains and settling a new frontier. In other words, we open up technologies in new territory. It's a story that was not really like computing before. Rarely, if ever, do we take those covered wagons and try to bring innovation and new technology advances into complex established systems. That's what we have to do in energy. And that is a lot like parachuting into occupied territory. And we don't do that very often. We do biotech. We don't go back and fix the healthcare delivery system, right? We do, while the innovations are coming in solar photovoltaics, we don't go back and fix the grid, right? We're going to have to learn how to fix the grid, right? In this energy revolution we're talking about, and we're not really organized. We haven't really thought through an innovation system that's going to help us do that well. So we need to think that system through sooner rather than later. It's kind of what I'm arguing today. We are going to need a carbon charge, in my view. A market-based incentive is going to be a crucial signal to bring new technologies in, as well as to encourage technology incremental innovation in established systems. I agree with my colleagues here that that's not the only thing we're going to need. We're going to need substantial public investment at a different kind of scale than we've been operating at in the energy area. And what would that new energy program look like? It's going to be very large in scale and scope, as we've talked about here. There's going to be profound private sector leadership. This has got to be a public and private sector effort, because these technologies have to land in the private sector. This is not like the Apollo mission that was essentially a government contract. This has got to land in a powerful private sector, and there's got to be deep private sector leadership and involvement in this effort. We need to find a way to bring some technology neutrality into our selection process. We have 40 years ahead of embarking on this effort. We're going to come up with a lot of technologies in that process. We need to avoid technology lock-in, freezing into the wrong technology pits. And we've already done a fair amount of lock-in to the wrong technologies. We need to develop a system that's open enough and neutral enough to allow the better technologies to prevail. And I think we have to organize this effort around the major obstacles in a complex established system to market launch, which I think is the key moment, right, in this innovation system. For an innovation system into a new frontier, the key moment was the valley of death between R&D. And that remains important in energy, but there's a new big innovation system problem, which is the moment of market launch, and make sure we can get these new technologies actually in the market. And that is a harder challenge, and one we haven't really organized around before. I'd like to think about this in terms of about 3 steps, and just bear with me for a few minutes. There's going to be a lot of technologies that are going to have to stand up. This is not a single focused technology effort, like an Apollo mission, like a Manhattan Project. There's a lot of technologies that have to get stood up here. You can group those technologies by their launch pathways, by the kind of characteristics they seem to assume in their launch pathway systems. Right? And I'll try and talk about some of those in a second. But if you can identify the different launch pathways 4, 5, 6 of them. Then you can begin to tie support packages that make sense for that category. There's not going to be a single launch pathway. There's going to be varied launch pathways. And we've got to tie the incentive system to make sense for those different launch items. And then the third point I'll make is that we've got deep gaps in our innovation system. And Mark's talked about some of those gaps, and I'll elaborate on it a little bit. First, step one, the launch pathways. I think there are 6. I'll try and keep this fairly straightforward. We have a lot of experimental technologies that we need to keep doing R&D on. Let's keep doing that, right? They're not going to be ready soon. Fusion, hydrogen fuel cells, etc. Right? Let's keep working on this stuff, but we don't have to worry about actual market launch because we're a long way away from that. That's category 1. Category 2, there are going to be disruptive innovations that can land in niches. Right? And we're pretty good at this system, right? That's kind of what we do when we do new technologies. We launch new breakthroughs and we stand them up in niches, and then they grow in niches, and then they get into wider marketplaces. And we can do a fair amount of that, right? So solar photovoltaics, wind technologies that can be off-grid, for example. LEDs already are deep into niche markets. So those are examples of technologies in that kind of category. The problem with energy is that most energy technologies, at least for this foreseeable future, are going to be component technologies. In other words, they are going to be parts of larger technology systems. So we have breakthrough, lithium-ion, nanotechnology-oriented batteries that enable plug-in hybrids. Those batteries are part of a larger auto system, right? We're going to do advanced geothermal, but that's going to get launched into a larger utility system, right? Most new energy technologies will be components. I think there's 2 categories of those component technologies. One is, some of those technologies, the industries are going to want if they can get in a price range, right? If they can become acceptable in price to the public. Plug-in hybrids fall into that category. I think advanced geothermal falls into that category. Then there are going to be technologies that the recipient systems, the recipient platforms can't take, right? No utility is going to be able to take carbon capture and sequestration unless they're told to, because they'd have to hand their customers whatever it is, 20 to 30% price increase at the retail level. So there are these component technologies where you're going to need a regulatory move to enable adaptation. It could be a pricing move, it could be a regulatory move. So that's the 4th category. And then there's 2 crossover categories. And they're pretty obvious. One is, there's an enormous amount of mileage to be gained from efficiency and conservation. And then secondly, we need to drive down systematically, as Mike talked about, manufacturing costs. And these apply across the board to both established technologies as well as to new technologies. So those are the 6 categories. And if you look at those 6, then you can begin to think about the incentive packages tied to each. They're all going to need R&D. Some can need specific incentives that enable them to come to price range. But this category, component innovations that face a contested launch, they're going to need a regulatory maneuver as well. Maybe that's cap and trade, or maybe that's another regulatory maneuver, like fuel economy standards. So we've got the launch categories, and you can begin to think about the network of incentives that would tie to each of those launch categories. The 3rd piece, I just want to briefly mention here. We have gaps in our innovation system. And simply pouring more money into the existing innovation system is not going to work. As Mark noted, we're starting to make some very important shifts in that innovation system. We're starting to build translational research capability into our R&D system, right? Very important step through the new entities that we talked about. Secondly, we're beginning to think about a financing mechanism. To launch these technologies at scale, they're going to need big-time financing at a moment when our financing system is in complete disarray. We're going to need a financing piece through our green banks proposal in both energy bills and House and Senate under consideration. We're moving along in this direction. The 3rd piece, and we haven't talked about this yet, but I think we're going to need to get the technology roadmap. And we're not going to get there easily, but at least we could get to a technology strategy step first. But it's got to be a strategy that's put together between public and private sectors with a lot of expertise in the academic community thrown in. Can we begin to think about the way in which we're going to layer these new entrant technologies, both the existing ones and the sort of best bets in the future, into the system, and make sure we don't slip into technology lock-in and preserve some technology neutral. So those are the structural issues that I see. And I think that if we reach the investment levels at the kind of scale that we're talking about, we also need to think about these innovation organizations. It's, again, not mission impossible. And there is a huge opportunity. The United States has led virtually every technology revolution, every big innovation wave since about 1840. It's an open question whether we believe this. But the economic opportunities are profound if we can get around it. Thanks.
Great, okay, well, we're open to any and all questions here. Any questions right off? Otherwise, I have one for Nate Lewis.
All right.
You're back to
I have one for William, or anybody can answer this. And he made the point about staying technology neutral. And my concern is that some of these technologies are so different that you kind of have to decide you're going to get there. And let me just give one example, which is not just, and that's hydrogen cars, which is not to say that we necessarily want to do that. But if we did, kind of the system that I've seen is like you start with, gas station level workers who take methane and give people hydrogen, which you need to now spread around the city, enough so that people start to buy them, and then they kind of scale up from there. And it's kind of hard to see how that could happen unless somebody makes a decision on at least a Holland-wide scale that we are going to have hydrogen cars, we're going to pick this, and we're going to make it happen. And so I guess the question is, how does this kind of forcing on we have to be technically neutral automatically take out certain potential technologies, because you can't get there unless you decide that's where you want to go?
Yeah, I'm not saying we should not demonstrate technologies at scale, right? I think we're going to need to do that in cases, right? And the scale doesn't necessarily have to be the world, right? We can focus on, obviously, in the case you mentioned on it, on a reasonable geographic territory that gives us a sense of how the systems work. They're not easy to design these necessarily, but they certainly can be done. And part of a financing entity's role would be to take on this task of financing demonstrations at scale. Let me just say something a little larger about the way in which we're proceeding policy-wise in the legislative process. And look, I worked in it for many years, but our energy bills tend to do the following. We have a title for, you name it, biofuels. And we have a title for whatever it is, enhanced geothermal. And we have a title for carbon capture and sequestration control. And then we have a title for this and a title for that, and so on. And they tend to be, they carry with them their own unique incentive packages. Right? So there's no commonality across these different technologies to a substantial extent. Right? And I worry that that system, which is the way we've been writing legislation, is going to preclude any kind of technology neutrality. Because in effect, based upon really on the effectiveness of the interest in its lobby and its organization, a huge winner in the 07 Act was biofuels. Yeah, important technology there. But we probably should have been more balanced in our approach. Suppose we wrote bills in a different way. Suppose we wrote them the other way around. We designed the incentive packages, right? And Congress figured out what those ought to look like and thought about the energy pathways that we needed. And then had our technologies qualify to get into those packages. I think we will never get technology neutrality perfectly by any means. It's going to be rough justice. But I worry that the way we're writing bills now, in fact, precludes us from getting there because we are locking in technologies very early.
Hi, I'm Alan Rosenberg with House Science and Technology. The question is actually for you. You compared the administration's proposed energy innovation hubs to the Brookings reports, Energy and Discovery Innovation Institutes, but there are some policy differences. One is that the hubs would have no money for construction. They're about 25 million a year, as opposed to some of the hubs which are 100 to 200 million. Each hub is specifically focused on an area that was identified by the secretary. There's no requirement for regional distribution, and NSF is not the lead agency in reviewing them. So are you still satisfied with the administration's overall approach with the Energy Innovation Hub?
We think the DOE hubs are a very strong, we are not doctrinaire about the conceptual architecture here. We see much of what our group was talking about in them. And there's much to recommend as well, the Clean Energy Innovation Centers in the Blackstone Marquee package. I want to have Nate speak also to, in many respects, what a clear model for the DOE hubs is. Which, it's quite clear that there's a specific, quite successful model that is a few degrees different from what we suggested, but it's also something that we upheld in our report as a strong model. So, Nate is an expert on that. So.
In contrasting the President's proposal and how DOE would implement their 8 hubs versus other proposals, I think it's important to understand the perspective that the 8 hubs should be viewed as tests of experiments in innovation. And we need to do a lot of those experiments. We need to do them on a variety of scales. The DOE's proposals are actually, I personally believe, very credible and sensible. There are, if you ask most technologists, what are the key areas out of the top 10 where we don't have things under control? It would be carbon capture and storage. Does it work technically? It would be energy storage. It would be materials for nuclear reactors. It would be advanced solar photovoltaics. It would be artificial solar fuels. Those are fibers. It would be building efficiency. And it would be advanced modeling and simulation. You might add 1 or 2 more. Those exactly are the topics proposed by the Secretary for what the hubs should be. I think it's hard to say you should not endorse that, because it's useful to think about new models when, instead of complementing the system where we have individual researchers and small research groups like the Energy Frontier Research Centers working from the bottom up, that there are then teams of people focused in 1 or maybe 2 places on key problems. I personally think that we need to view these as starting points. And just like in healthcare, we don't just have 1 location in the country on curing cancer or medical school at 1 university. We have them all over the place. And there can be different forms of follow-on hubs. I think that would be prudent too. Some that are involving the National Science Foundation that have a different model for hub versus spokes and regionality. I think we need to get these experiments in innovation on several scales of translational research done in order to try to help better connect the basic research to the market-facing energy industry, which our DOE has historically not been very good at all. There are certain things that they have done in this, all the energy efficiency innovations of dual pane windows and LED lighting and compact fluorescent light bulbs have come out of basic research in one form or another in the DOE complex. But the scale of what we need to do in all these different areas is now much bigger. We went from little league to the big leagues in terms of the size of the field and the fences. And we're going to need to do all of these things. So I personally think that one should view the proposed DOE hubs as a very useful starting point for a model, and I think we should get them going That's not enough, and I would say there should be other models layered on top of that with regional, with bigger budgets, things that provide many technologies, not just to focus on one, and synergies between them. And we need to view this as an overall system.
And I think that there's much to recommend the Latin architecture, which draws perhaps more than the DOE ones, in the sense that we see these as embedded in regional innovation zones, in which the hub is intimately connected to industry clusters and so on, and regional economic development. We see as another collateral benefit, and their language stresses that. I think that's an attractive portion. Anyway.
So we recognize that there have these sort of fundamental scientific problems that we have to accomplish in the end. So that's the big one. But why would building billions of dollars worth of what would ultimately be an alternate laboratory system in an Asian university to accomplish that? What do you have to guarantee that the university program to be any better at doing this than what we've done already? And does the federal government just keep going in perpetuity, or do you have to launch at a certain point? Does the federal government actually build these things? And you're talking about federal money for this at $6 billion a year. It's quite aggressive. So
I don't know.
Why does it work?
Proposed what? So here's the, and I don't think my role here was necessarily to defend the structure proposed for these particular hubs, as opposed to getting across the bigger picture message that there are key scientific and technological challenges, and we have to figure out a structure that gives us the best chance of trying to solve them. I mean, ultimately, that's the top line message. When I tell my scientific coworkers about all this stuff they're working on, curing cancer and the brain, and I tell them, all that stuff can wait. And that's really true. Look, if we don't cure cancer in 30 years, the world's going to stay the same. Well, like it or not, if we don't build the next computer, the world's going to stay the same. But if we don't fix this problem within the next 30 years, because CO2 emissions last for 1,000 years, pure and simple, the world is not going to stay the same. That means that we have to try varieties of models. I can't guarantee you that putting together 100 scientists and engineers working on a variety of angles focused on a common problem in a model like Bell Labs is necessarily going to be where the invention is going to come and get commercialized and developed. But I think there's a credible chance that by doing some of that, as well as feeding on the base, you can do things that an individual laboratory won't do. An individual laboratory might develop a catalyst for oxidizing water, but it has to work with a catalyst that's reducing water. And they have no vested interest in finding a partner to do that, or in building the system with a membrane to do that, and putting together the pieces. And so our basic R&D distributed system does have gaps in going from basic research into technology innovation that then can be prototyped and gone to industry. And I think if you would look at the current model, it may well be that by the time an invention is started in a small laboratory and then gotten all the way through the system, it will take 30 years. And we don't have 30 years to do that anymore, because we'll have 30 more years of emissions under our belts. So I can't guarantee that these will all be completely productive or optimal, but I do think that we need to do experiments in the way we innovate on energy, because we just don't have that much time.
I had a question. Mr. Schellenberg was mentioning that waxing market might not be as aggressive as needed, might not be able to put out for the current problem that Mr. Lewis is speaking about. But the plan that you mentioned seemed a little bit more complex than the simple carbon cap and trade system. I was wondering what needs to happen politically here on the Hill from your experience to pass a more complex system than what we already have.
Well, let me just say that I think we are making, a fair amount of progress in moving in this direction, right? The President's proposed a $15 billion program, Clean Energy Technology Fund. You take cap and trade revenues, you put them in a fund, you can begin to stabilize the annual revenues and, allocate them from that. It's obviously not a provision that's, in the market-waxing bill at this point, but, there's a lengthy political process ahead for this. I think the fund approach is an important piece. We have been making progress on addressing this organizational issue on translational research that Nate's been talking about and Mark. So we are making progress on our institutional side. There's more pieces we've got to get into place there, but we can begin to see what those pieces are. Right? I do think that as we do the next generation or two of energy bills, we are going to have to think about how we organize those bills for the long term. Right? We've been essentially writing bills for like 2 or 3 year duration, and then picking up 2 or 3 years later and moving to the next 2 or 3 years. But I think we're going to have to think longer term about the structure of the way we put those bills together and focus more on what the incentive packages are rather than dictate particular technology solutions. Right? I'm not saying that what we've done in these bills is bad. I think there have been some very important steps in these bills. But I do think we need to move to a somewhat different structure. So none of this stuff, the problem is landing these technologies into a complex sector. It's not that the organizational tasks to do this are a nightmare. It's just that we've got to think it through because it's different than the way in which we've done innovation before. It's different from the way in which we do innovation in IT. It's different than the way we do innovation in biotech. It's going to call for a different structure. And we're going to need to think that structure through, and some of the institutional elements we've been talking about, I think, are important. Does that help?
Yeah, I mean, has there been any precedent for writing bills or future bills?
No.
It's 2:30, so I want to give those of you who are dealing with the crushing business on the Hill a chance to hit Lord. At the same time, I think we could say a few more minutes. We have people come up after more questions. Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Okay.
Thanks.